Well, thank you, Dr. Nuru Jeter. Thank you, Dr. Bertosi. Thank you all for coming here. And I am excited. There is so much energy in the room. What I want to do today is share some of the tools that I hope you will take out into the world as you engage with me and with the American Public Health Association in launching a national campaign against racism. Some of you are familiar with some of these tools already. So some of you have heard my Gardener's Tale, some of you have heard different things, but there is something new in here for all of you. So just, if you've heard the Gardener's Tale before, I want you to listen so deeply that you can tell it back, right? And I'm actually going to start with another framing, my cliff analogy, to talk about levels of health intervention, because some people might ask, why would I, with molecular biology and medicine and epidemiology, even be talking about racism and health? So this is going to frame the whole discussion, and then we'll jump squarely into racism. But let's think about this person who's just wandering along this path, and whoops, boom. They have just fallen off of the cliff of good health. And if that were you or somebody in your family, you would be delighted to find an ambulance there at the bottom of the cliff to speed you on to care. But if we were concerned, because we're at a school of public health, about others who may come along that cliff, about community health, population health, public health, we might well ask ourselves, what can we put in place besides just stationing lots of ambulances at the bottom of the cliff? So somebody's going to say, I know, let's put a net halfway down, right? We'll catch people before they get crunched up at the bottom. But a net, as good an idea as it is, does have holes in them, so some people might fall through the cracks. But we could even make that a trampoline halfway down that cliff, couldn't we? We could have a trampoline, but if even a trampoline, no holes, might have with lots of people just bouncing up and down at half functionality, not able to get back to the top of the cliff. So, okay, what else can we do as a health intervention? Well, clearly we need to think about a fence at the edge of the cliff to keep people from falling in the first place. But that's got to be a very, very strong fence if there's a lot of population pressure against it. So what else can we do? We can move the population away from the edge of the cliff. So I'm going to label the interventions that I've described so far, where the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff represents medical care and tertiary prevention. So when you think in public health about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention is preventing complications from disease that's already manifest, preventing the amputations from diabetes and the like. The net, or trampoline halfway down, these are our safety net programs, and secondary prevention, which is about early detection, screening. The fence represents primary prevention, keeping things from happening in the first place, like immunizations. And moving the population away from the edge of the cliff is about addressing the so-called social determinants of health, the determinants of health and illness that are outside of the individual. They're beyond our genes, they're beyond our individual behaviors, and they are in fact the context in which our behaviors arise and in which our behaviors are either health protecting or health injuring. So they include things like poverty or wealth. They include adverse neighborhood conditions like living in a food desert, or not having sidewalks in your neighborhood, or even transportation system, not having jobs, and not having safety, in that the police officers are actually shooting your children as opposed to protecting them, where the playgrounds might be not where the children frolic and play and commune with nature, but where the drugs are being sold and the like. Now, we could have a conversation about infant mortality, and we'd be talking about the ambulance as neonatal intensive care units, and about the net as prenatal care, and maybe the fence would be our WIC programs, women, infants, and children, and maybe moving the population away from the edge of the cliff would be excellent educational opportunities for young girls so they don't have babies so soon. We could take this to the State House, we could take this to Congress in terms of how should we be spending our health resources. But so far, as useful as this diagram is, it has a fatal flaw. The fatal flaw being that it does not yet talk about how health disparities arise. So I want you to keep this cliff in the back of your mind. We're going to shift gears for just a moment to talk about how health disparities arise, and then we'll come back to the cliff. So when we talk about how health disparities arise, especially when we're talking about racial, ethnic health disparities, we unfortunately have lots of evidence about differences in the quality of care received within the healthcare system. In 2002, the Institute of Medicine released its Unequal Treatment Report, which pulled together what were then hundreds of studies. If we were to do the same thing, it would be thousands of studies now, documenting differences in the quality quality of care, even if everybody's in the same VA system or everybody covered by Medicare or Medicaid. Differences in how your chest pain might be investigated or treated, depending on your race. Differences in how much pain medication you might get if you walk into an emergency department with a long bone fracture, depending on your ethnicity. But even those folks who wrote the IMWIM report said it's not just happening within the healthcare system, because folks are having problems accessing that healthcare system in the first place. That's a second level at which health disparities arise. But then we in this room must understand that health is not created within the health sector. So there is a third level at which health disparities arise, which are differences in our life experiences, differences in our underlying opportunities and exposures and stresses that are making some individuals and communities sicker than others in the first place. And when you think about these three levels at which health disparities arise, differences in quality of care, differences in access to care, and differences in underlying exposures and opportunities, it's like a pyramid, really, or maybe better yet, it's like an iceberg, and the huge hidden base are the differences in the quality of our lives. And then you have people who've been made sick or frustrated because of limited access to the health care system. And then even the lucky ones who get into the system are sometimes further injured because of differences in quality of care. So now, thinking about those three levels at which health disparities arise, we're going to go back to our cliff. But now, we're going to recognize that we're really not dealing with a flat, two-dimensional cliff, but actually we're dealing with a three-dimensional cliff. And at some parts of the cliff, there might be an ambulance there, but maybe that ambulance has a flat tire, so it's slow or goes off in the wrong direction. Or maybe there's no ambulance there at all, or maybe there's no net nor fence. And usually at those parts of the cliff, the population is being pushed closer to the edge. So now I'm going to label the observations about this three-dimensional cliff with how health disparities arise, where the differences in quality of care are represented when the ambulance is there, but it slower goes off in the wrong direction. The differences in access to care are no ambulance, no net, no fence. And the differences in underlying exposures and opportunities are represented by the closer proximity of that greeny population to the edge. So now that we recognize that we're dealing with a three-dimensional cliff, there is a whole set of new questions that arise. The first being, how did the cliff become three-dimensional in the first place? And that's usually because of historical injustices that are perpetuated by present-day contemporary structural factors. But given that the cliff is three-dimensional, we also need to ask, why are there differences in how resources are distributed along that cliff face? And why are there differences in who's found at different parts of the cliff? And why are the oranges back there and away and the greenies being pushed closer to the edge? And when you start asking and addressing these kinds of questions, you're now addressing the social determinants of equity, which differ from the social determinants of health. If the social determinants of health are things like poverty and adverse neighborhood conditions and the like, the social determinants of equity are systems of power that can distribute resources and populations. They include racism and sexism and heterosexism and economic systems like capitalism and the like. And so with this cliff, I've actually distilled three different dimensions of health intervention. And if you go back to your junior high or high school geometry and you think about dimensions, one dimension is a line, two dimensions is a flat plane, three dimensions is space. Along that line at the edge of the cliff is where we can display all of our health care, all of our health services, our preventive and curative health services. This is the conversation that we have in this country when we say health. People will immediately complete that thought for you and go to health care or health services. And as hard as we're trying to struggle toward universal access to high quality health care, with a stopping point of the Affordable Care Act, which we need to support and expand and the like, or remake. I'm not getting political here, so okay. No, I just reckon, so anyway, ignore that, right. You can do it however. We need to get to universal access to high quality health care, but that's not because that in and of itself is going to result in large and sustained improvements in health outcomes or the elimination of health disparities. We want universal access to high quality health care because that is how a civilized society values all of its people equally, right? But we recognize, as wonderful as the system is and as universal as the access is, we can overwhelm any system. So we have to move into that second dimension, which we can display in a flat plane, and move the population away from the edge of the cliff if we're going to have if we're going to achieve large and sustained improvements in health outcomes, we have to address the social determinants of health, including poverty and educational opportunities and housing and job opportunities and the criminal justice system and the like. We must address the conditions of our lives. But if we do that without recognizing that we're really dealing with a three-dimensional cliff, we are at risk of moving some of the population away from the edge of the cliff, but not all of the population, and we are at risk of actually making health disparities worse. So we have to recognize and address the three-dimensionality of the cliff. We have to address the social determinants of equity or of inequity, including racism, sexism, heterosexism, capitalism, and the like, if we're going to achieve social justice and eliminate health disparities. Now, usually, I would say, anybody with a question here? But I only have 50 minutes, so we are going to just plow through. So if you have a question, write it down, okay? Because now I've said the word racism about 3 or 4 times, and nobody fell out of their chair, so we're going to go. So what do I mean when I say the word racism? I am clear that I am talking about a system. I am not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. I am talking about a system of power. And it's a system of doing what? It's a system of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is what we call race in this country. So here I am in Berkeley. I think I'm still black. I know in Atlanta I'm black, okay? So you look at me, I'm clearly black, right? I don't know. In some parts of Brazil, you would look at me, I'd be just as clearly white. I do know that. If you were to look at me in South Africa, I would be clearly colored, right? Here I am, same physical appearance, but in at least those 3 settings, the social interpretation of my appearance would put me into 3 different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, then my health outcome would become that of the group to which I've been assigned, even though I'd have the same genes in all 3 places. So I have just defined racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on so-called race, based on the social interpretation of how one looks. What are the impacts of this system? Well, you know, when we think or talk about racism at all in this country, we usually finally get to the fact that it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. But it doesn't take very long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. That's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country. It's challenging, but I'm going to give us a tool even to talk about that. But now, okay, we recognize we have a system that's either unfairly disadvantaging or unfairly advantaging individuals and communities. This system, as it does that, is also sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. There are many examples I could give you of that, so I'm going to just give you 2. The first being how we as a nation are not vigorously investing in the full, excellent public education of all of our kids, because the blinders of racism that make us not value all of us equally make us believe that there is no genius in the barrios or in the ghettos or on the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. But of course we know there is genius in all of our communities. And if we were to fully invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation or even as a world. Some of you may have heard me already speculate that we would already be up on Mars farming if that were a good thing to do, if we were to invest in all of that genius, right? But another very profound manifestation of how racism is sapping the strength of all of us is how it has made us as a nation complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many black and brown men in our prison system, as if that did not separate us from human potential. And for those of you who know people who are either caught up in the prison system or cycling in and out, coming out, in many states can't vote, can't get public housing, can't get a job, you know that there are many geniuses who, if there had only been some other way, would be contributing very productively to our society. So I actually will say that of the 3 impacts of racism that I have outlined here, the most profound to me is how it saps the strength of the whole society. And if we were to do our media stories about that, our data collection, our conversations around our dinner tables about that, then we would engage more of us, I don't know if we'll ever have all, but more of us in trying to dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. But now, how could racism impact health? Now, many of you are familiar with my 3 levels of racism, but for about the 1/3 of you who haven't heard it, I'm going to tell the Gardener's tale again. And the rest of you, listen hard so you can tell it back tonight, okay? I find it useful to think about these 3 levels of racism, not just to ask, how could racism cause increased asthma prevalence in some communities versus others, or how could it cause obesity in some areas and not others, but also to guide us in what should we do about it. So I talk about institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized racism, where I define institutionalized racism as that system, those structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator. This is the kind of racism that's been institutionalized in our laws and customs and practices and policies. And it's the kind of racism that often shows up as inherited disadvantage or its reciprocal inherited advantage. We see it in terms of material conditions and in terms of access to power. So differential access, for example, to quality housing by race, or differential access to equal educational opportunities, or equal employment opportunities, or the same level of income at the same level of employment. And those things can impact health. Differential access to medical facilities, including linguistic access to medical facilities, or to a clean environment and the whole well-documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites or bus transfer stations in communities of color. In terms of power, differential access to information, which could be health information or even information about our own histories. Power as resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources and knowing somebody on the board. Power as voice in government and media and the like. And often, when I get about here in a talk, somebody might raise their hand and say, well, Dr. Jones, look at that top bullet of examples. Housing, education, employment, and income. Isn't that what we call social class, really? So Dr. Jones, are you talking about racism or are you really talking about social class? And I imagine that there's some people in this room who would like to hear what I say to that. So I'm going to answer that question by observing that it doesn't just so happen that people of color are overrepresented in poverty in this country while white people are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized or stigmatized or oppressed group of color, there's been some initial historical insult. So I could give a whole litany, but I'm just going to lift up 2 because I only have 15 minutes. So the first, the most profound would be for American Indians, the taking of the land and the near genocide, and then the moving of the survivors to reserve lands, reservations, and then in some instances, something good was found under one reservation. Well, you got to pick them up and move them somewhere else. For people of African descent, it started with the kidnapping of West African people and then our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then what I describe for the survivors and their progeny, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then people might say, oh, Dr. Jones, you're talking about slavery. You know, don't go there, right? You know, we recognize that that was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history, right? But Dr. Jones, really, the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865, and we're in 2016, and that was 151 years ago. So Dr. Jones, really, all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase there is all else being equal. And all else has not been equal, and all else still is not equal today. There are what I describe as contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating each of these initial historical injustices, and these contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of institutionalized racism. So when people ask me, are you talking about racism, or are you really talking about social class, I say that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. And that is a very important aha. Because what it means is that as important as it is for us to eliminate poverty in this country, and I would go farther, I would eliminate income inequality. I'd flatten the whole thing out. Yes, I would. Give me a magic wand, boom, 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 done. But if I did that without paying attention to the background structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that were put in place to differentially shunt different populations into different possibilities, even if I were to equalize things today within one generation with within 20 years, I think we would start to see a stratification by race in terms of social class again. Before I leave institutionalized racism, I also need to say that it can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission, and very often institutionalized racism shows up as inaction in the face of need. We saw that in Flint, Michigan. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. This is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and then the different action, the discrimination. Many people call this interpersonal racism. I keep calling it personally mediated racism, although it twists my mouth up every time I say that. But that's because I'm still understanding racism as a system. And this is the system mediated through people. So how does it impact health? Well, police brutality, I don't have to say more. I used to have a whole, imagine you were pulled over for driving while Latino or driving while Black and interpreted as resisting arrest and hit upside the head, right? That used to be my story. I can give you the names now of people because we have cell phones and dash cams and all that. So we can talk about Eric Garner and Mike Brown and Freddie Gray. And we can talk about, Walter Scott and Tamir Rice, little Tamir Rice. And then not even police brutality, Trayvon Martin, a self-appointed neighborhood watchman who thinks that this young boy does not look like he belongs in his father's neighborhood, and on and on and on. And this not only impacts the health of those people who are killed, but it impacts the health of our families and of our communities, and should affect the health of our whole nation. This is not right. We need more accountability there. I know this is some of the work that people in this room are trying to do, right? But that impacts our health. Physician disrespect, which can be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician figures, well, that patient couldn't afford or wouldn't comply or wouldn't understand or whatever they presume about the patient. Or physician disrespect could be quite blatant, like sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our nation's history. It includes shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores. Not even asked, may I help you? Just followed around. Waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment. And those are just two examples of what some people call everyday racism, kind of the microaggressions, the subtle communication of disrespect that may be related to elevated blood pressures in populations of color, blood pressures that don't even go down at night. Teacher devaluation, that's a very important manifestation of personally mediated racism. Because if a teacher looks at a young child and thinks that child can't learn, and puts them off in the ADD track, that child will never even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. Now, personally mediated racism, like institutionalized, can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. But even more important to understand is that personally mediated racism can be unintentional, as well as intentional. You do not have to have done something, have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I define as acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. And, I'm speaking here from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races, and I've had people, my colleagues who do anti-racism training and say, well, Kamara, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people walk around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. But for today, I'm going to pack it off with the institutionalized normative stuff. So right now, I need to spend more time looking at that and how that might actually result in psychiatric illness, right? But for right now, I'm not talking about that. So right now, I'm talking about, from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races, how can this negatively impact our health? Well, self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as. So maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school or apply to that college or apply for that job or try to live in that neighborhood. And in fact, this self-devaluation turns into fratricide, Black on Black or Latino on Latino crime, because if you don't value yourself, you won't value somebody who looks just like you, and you just as soon off them as not. The white man's Isis Calder syndrome, that phraseology comes from my parents' generation. And what it meant then for people of color, it still means today for many people of color. Say you're black and you need a lawyer, you might go seek out a white lawyer over a black lawyer. Or if you need a doctor, you might go look for a white doctor over a black doctor. In fact, if your lemonade was warm, you might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. Resignation and helplessness and hopelessness are other manifestations of internalized racism. And it turns into self-destructive health behaviors, turns into not registering to vote, turns into not voting even if you are registered. And it's really about accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So if you hear young high school students of color teasing one of their friends who's trying to be the valedictorian of the class by saying, well, you know, so-and-so is just trying to be white, we need to challenge that. Because since when did white people claim exclusive access to excellence? They did not. So now I'm going to illustrate these 3 levels of racism with my Gardner's Tale allegory. And by now I must have about 25 allegories, most of them based on something I've seen with my own real eyes. So before I launch into this story about racism, I'm going to just briefly outline what I saw that sparked this story. And so my husband and I, newly married, moved down to Baltimore for me to finish my PhD at Hopkins. And we bought our first freestanding house with a big wraparound porch with flower boxes dotted on the porch. And it was October when we bought the house, so we didn't even pay attention. But when spring came, we were all excited, going to decorate our cute little house. So my husband runs out with our marigold seeds, and as he's preparing to plant, we notice that some of the boxes have dirt in them, and some of the boxes are empty. So he goes down to the gardening store, and he comes back hauling big old bags of potting soil, and we fill up the empty boxes, and then we put equal numbers of our marigold seeds in all of the boxes, and then we water them, and that just about has exhausted my gardening acumen. So at that point, I'm out of it, right? So I just sit back, gonna be delighted. Well, 3 weeks later, as I'm walking out of my front door onto my porch, I looked at those flower boxes, and I stopped in my tracks, because what I saw made me think that we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus the others, right? Because some of the boxes were full of plants, and they were tall, vigorous-looking plants, and other boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that my husband had brought was rich, fertile soil, so that every single seed planted in the rich, fertile soil had sprouted. The strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found there turned out to be poor rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor rocky soil had died, and even the strong seed in the poor rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And maybe you guys are gardeners, maybe you've composted half of your garden, so maybe you've seen this image with your own real eyes, and the image is actually one about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to make this a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we're going to have a gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil, and the pink seed she throws over in the poor, rocky soil, and 3 weeks later in her boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all of the red seed has sprouted. The strong red seed has grown very tall and vigorous. Even the weak red seed has made it halfway up. In that poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died. Here comes the strong pink seed struggling, just trying to make it to a middling height. And then in those 2 flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens until finally 10 years later, the gardener is looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we interrupt that story for just a moment to say the first part of this story is how institutionalized racism works. Where you had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the 2 types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But let's pick the story back up and say, well, where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, the gardener's looking over at red, loving her red flowers, and she looks at the pink blossoms, and she says, oh, those flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly, so she plucks off a pink blossom, or all of them, before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, so she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that is going on. And then where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not either understanding or acknowledging that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red, right? And here come the bees. And the bees are just minding their own business, collecting nectar, but of course they're pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee into one of the pink flowers and bzzz, to another pink flower, and then bzzz, to this pink flower, and this flower says, "Get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red," because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in the garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism, couldn't we? So we could go over to the pink flowers and we could say, "Pink is beautiful, power to the pink." And that, it's an important intervention. It is an important intervention. I'm not making light of it, but if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, okay, well, let's address the personally mediated racism. So let's have a conversation with the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener, which is also all good. It's all good. I'm sorry. So we have our workshop. And in the workshop, oh no, that cannot be. Okay, I just saw a time thing. Okay, so we have our workshop. And in the workshop, we say, "Dear gardener, would you please stop plucking the pink flowers?" And maybe she will and maybe she won't. But even if she stops plucking the pink flowers, it's still not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. What you really need to do if you want to set things right in the garden is to address the institutionalized racism, which means you have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although in my mind it makes it easier for the gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if you keep separate boxes, it means you have to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil, and when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious, so that in that intervention you will have also addressed the internalized racism, because pink will no longer be looking over at red, thinking red is better or wanting to be red. And in that intervention, you may also address the personally mediated racism. So now the original gardener, she might have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful would be less likely to have those kinds of attitudes. So this story was to talk about these three levels and to say that we need to at least address institutionalized racism. Good to address all the levels at the same time. But we need to at least address the institutionalized, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. But now there's a very important question that remains that I hadn't raised until now, which is, who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I gave in my story the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which in my mind are the elements of self-determination. So who is the gardener? Well, government is a huge part of the gardener. I used to say government up there until I went to CDC, so I changed my slide. Oh, that's true. Oh, that's very true. So government, but it's not just government, so it's media, foundations, corporations, communities to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. You know, I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink. And it's equally dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she looks at her flower boxes and thinks that her boxes are fine. You know, her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. So our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? Lots of questions that can come out of this. I just want to leave with you two questions before I leave this story that have come up in the past. One, I was asked, Dr. Jones, excuse me, but why should the red flowers share their soil? And I thought, wow, that's a really important question. First of all, it shows the power of this story to start conversations about racism. Because if we were talking about racism between you and me, that question would never even come up. But my answer to why should the red flowers share their soil is that that soil does not belong to the red flowers. It belongs to the garden, okay? But then what about if this is not the original gardener? What if this is the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild? Here we are, right? Always seeing the flowers looking like this. What then? So there are three things I'll just hit quickly. We need to make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem. We need to be talking about eliminating those disparities, not just reducing black infant mortality rate and white infant mortality rate like this, but to eliminate the gap. But then in order to do that, we need to make those flower boxes transparent. We need to be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil. That has to be front and foremost anytime we're documenting any race-associated difference. We have to talk about that. And we have to make it very clear that those pink seed didn't just jump over into that poor rocky soil. So we have to talk about history, and we have to talk about the gardener's agency in all of this, right? And in fact, my story used to be, if you heard me tell the story before, it was just about the soil, right? It was about the quality of the soil. It is now, I understood all of a sudden that the gardener's initial preference for red over pink, that white supremacist ideology, that cultural racism, that if she continues to prefer red over pink, even if she equalizes the soil today, she will continue to privilege red over pink. So we must address not just the opportunity structures in terms of the soil, but also the societal valuation and white supremacist ideology. We must, or else we will not untangle this knot. So I wanted to just now give you a few more tools very quickly, and then I'm going to end with two very quick allegories. So I'm going to be, you thought I was talking fast before. Here we are. I just want to say, if you don't take much from this thing, I do want you to take this question: how is racism operating here with you here? Because institutionalized racism is not, racism itself is not a miasma. It's not a cloud that we cannot get a handle on. It is a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms, where the mechanisms are in our structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, where the structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making. Who's at the table, who's not, what's on the agenda. The policies are the written how, the practices and norms are the unwritten how, and the values are the why. And we need to take this question, how is racism operating here, with us to our children's school, or to our community, or even to the UC Berkeley School of Public Health, or to wherever it is that you are working, okay? The definition I gave you before of racism can actually be generalized to be a definition of any system of structured inequity. So you could say, what is sexism? Well, that's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And there are many axes of inequity operating in our society today, intersecting in communities and in individuals, and they can include all of these things and more. And all of these are operating as, at least as risk markers for how opportunity is structured and how value is assigned, even as some of them are also risk factors in the progression to disease. So then you might ask me, well, Dr. Jones, if you recognize that all of this is going on, why do you focus your work on race as the axis of inequity and racism as the system? And my answer to that is that racism is foundational in our nation's history, and yet many people are in denial of its continued existence and profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation. And so I focus my work on race and racism because I think that this is the linchpin, and we can learn as we try to deal with all of these other axes of inequity and systems of structured inequity from what we can do. If we can dismantle that racism, we are well on our way. Now, I entitled my whole talk, Achieving Health Equity. Many people, you know, we used to talk about health disparities in public health, and then we shifted about 6, 7 years ago, maybe longer than that. I'm looking at Paula right now just because, you know, there's a shift. I'm going to share with you my definition of health equity, which differs actually from the Healthy People 2020 definition, to which I also contributed. But that definition got, you know, it went through clearance once, and then that was it, you know, and I have PowerPoint, right? So I can update mine. So it's a 3-part definition. What is it? How do we get there? And how is it related to health disparities? So I say that health equity is assurance of the conditions for optimal health for all people. Healthy People 2020 says health equity is attainment of the highest level of health for all people. And I actually agree that that is our goal. But what worries me about saying health equity is an outcome as opposed to a process is that what if we hit that last Sunday? Are we done? Right? So I think of health equity as a process. Which process? Assurance, which is actually one of the 3 core functions of public health identified by the Institute of Medicine, along with assessment and policy development. Assurance of what? Of the conditions for optimal health, for whom? For all people. How do we get there? It requires at least these 3 things: valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources according to need. And how is health equity related to health disparities? Well, health disparities will be eliminated when health equity is achieved. Health disparities, that's counting the numbers of different colored bodies at the bottom of the cliff, or the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers. It's about outcomes. Health equity is about all that stuff that came before. Now, I was going to spend some time on this, but we're just going to breeze through this. I have identified at least 3 huge societal barriers to achieving health equity, including the fact that we are ahistorical as a nation. The present is often viewed as disconnected from the past. The current distribution of advantage and disadvantage is viewed as happenstance, without reference to history. And systems and structures are either thought of as given or immutable, right? The second is the narrow focus on the individual. Self-interest is very narrowly defined. We don't even think about our extended family when we think about self-interest. There's a limited sense of interdependence and a limited sense of collective efficacy. When people say, what can I do? It should be, what can we do, right? And in this, systems and structures are either invisible or irrelevant because it's all about the individual. And the third one is what I call the myth of meritocracy. The myth that if you work hard, you'll make it. Now, most people who have made it have worked hard. Not everybody who's made it has worked hard, we know that, but most people have. But there are many, many, many other people who are working just as hard or harder who will never make it because we have an uneven playing field. We have structured inequity, and denial of racism is denial of some of that uneven playing field, right? And when we think about it, do we think that 2 babies are born with equal potential, or do we think that 2 babies are born with equal opportunity? If we think 2 babies are born with equal potential, then we have to look at the environment to say, well, why are we having different outcomes? But if we think that there's equal opportunity in this society, then when you see uneven outcomes in the adults, then you say, well, that one must be stupid or lazy. Okay, so what are we to do about that? Strategies for achieving health equity? Well, we need to change opportunity structures, which means we have to address the, ahistorical thing. We have to understand the importance of history. We have to change the narrow focus on the individual, expose the myth of meritocracy. And furthermore, American exceptionalism, that means that we have everything that we need right here and we're so special. We need to examine successful strategies from outside of this country. We need to acknowledge the existence of systems and structures and view them as modifiable and get, stop with this internal look at the gene. My God, I'm all for genetic science, but we have so much more that we know that we can intervene on right now. Why are we trying to get into that? And we need to break down barriers to opportunity, but it's not enough to just break down the barriers to opportunity. You could break down the barriers, but if you have a chasm, you need to build a bridge across that chasm, which I think actually community colleges and the president's focus on that is part of a bridge to opportunity. We need to do that. We need to transform from teaching our kids to be consumers to teaching them to be citizens, and we need to intervene on decision-making processes. When you are sitting at a decision-making table, your first job should be to look around and say, who is not here at this table who has an interest in this proceeding, right? And then, your job is not to represent them. Maybe in the short term you have to represent them, but you need to get them a seat at the table. And then in terms of, so that was all about opportunity structures, but I talked about the importance of valuing all people equally too. We need to break through our bubbles, okay? All of us live in bubbles. We have our little job bubble and maybe our kids' school and we go to church or community, whatever we do. We're all in a bubble, and so many of us are in such tight plexiglass bubbles that we don't know that there are people just across town who are just as funny, kind, generous, smart, hardworking as we are, but have very different life experiences and opportunities and context. So we need to create opportunities to break through our bubbles so that we can experience our common humanity. I could talk on that for days, so I won't do that. But the last point on here is that we need to not talk about my children and your children. We need to embrace all children as our children. So now I'm going to ask, who in this room has heard of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination? Raise your hand. Okay, so I see about, I'm going to say 10. What is it? It is an international anti-racism treaty that was adopted by the UN General Assembly way back in 1965. Who knew? Who knew that there was an international anti-racism treaty? So here's a question for you. Do you think the US signed this treaty? Surprise, surprise, surprise. US signed it in 1966. But the key there is that our diplomats can go and sign whatever treaties they want to, right? Because the Senate has to ratify a treaty. So you saw that was a trick question, right? Okay. Do you think the US Senate has ratified this treaty? Yes. 28 years later, but in 1994, the US Senate ratified this treaty, What that means is that today, our government, our nation, has international treaty obligations to do right under this 9-page international treaty. One of our obligations is to submit periodic reports. So our reports are due about every 6 years. We're always about a year late, but anyway, our third report was submitted to the committee at the UN in 2013. It was about 69 pages, an interesting read. I don't have time to go into that. But anyway, so 82 parallel reports were submitted. I mean, the School of Public Health at UC Berkeley, the next report around, could submit a parallel report. So 82 other reports were submitted, and the committee considered all of this in 2014, and then they sent back their concluding observations in September of 2014. It's only 14 pages, so we can all read that this weekend. It is not a telephone book. And it starts out, "Dear United States, thank you for your report. We remain concerned about racial profiling, residential segregation, the achievement gap in education, differential access to health care, disproportionate incarceration, and on and on and on." Who knew, right? They say, "Dear United States, please let your people know about the existence of this treaty." Right? So every time I talk, I do my part. I do. And they said, "Dear United States, you need to adopt a national action plan to combat structural racism," right? So actually, my national campaign against racism that we're launching from APHA, to which we invite all individuals and community partners. We don't have it set up on the website. Look March 1st, okay? March 1st, I think we're gonna be all ready, okay? But that I could construe as helping us meet our international treaty obligations. Anyway, so I was going to quickly talk about what it's going to look like at APHA. I'll just say we're going to have 7 standing committees. Communication and dissemination, that's going to be about naming racism and equipping people to talk about racism. Education and development, about creating curricula, perhaps, for schools of public health and schools of medicine. Global matters, to talk about this treaty, to let people know about the existence of the treaty and let people use it as an organizing tool. And also about the JAPER, the Joint Action Plan to Eliminate Racism, which is a US-Brazil joint effort. Liaison and partnership, to connect local anti-racism efforts, to identify them and connect them one to another. Organizational excellence, to take the question, how is racism operating here, into all of our context. And finally, policy and legislation, to catalog existing policies that are relevant and even propose new areas for legislation. So it's not just policy that names racism, but about citizen review boards and police, stuff, all of it. And then science and publications, to not only develop a compendium of racism measures and develop new measures, but to link anti-racism researchers with one another. So I'm going to close with 2 other stories. The first one, Dual Reality, a restaurant saga, was actually sparked by my experience when I was a medical student at an unnamed nearby university. Got it, I heard what you said, right? So, I was studying late with some colleagues, and we were hungry and there was no food in the apartment. So we decided to go into Palo Alto to find a restaurant to eat. And we found a restaurant and we went in and we sat down and we ordered our food and the food was served and we were eating. Here we are. And it's not a remarkable story yet. Many of you have had this experience. But as we were sitting there eating, I looked up and I noticed a sign, and it was a profound revelation to me about racism. So you're saying, oh, really, in Palo Alto, huh? What did the sign say? The sign said open. Think about this for a minute. Here I am sitting at the table of opportunity, eating, and I look up and I see a sign that says open. If I had not known anything about the two-sided nature of those signs, I would have presumed that hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, could come in and sit down and eat. But because of the hour, in fact, the restaurant was closed, and they would not be able to come in and sit down and eat. And then I understood how racism structures open, closed signs in our society. That racism structures a dual reality. And for those who are inside the restaurant, sitting at the table of opportunity, eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they do not even know that there is a two-sided sign going on. Because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. It is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white people in this country to recognize white privilege and racism. It is difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, except we got a little hint of that with Ebola. But for those on the outside, they're very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So for people who are inside the restaurant saying, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing, it's an empowering thing. It doesn't compel you to act, but you can choose to act. And if you care anything about the people on the other side of that sign, then you can talk to the restaurant owner who in fact is in there with you, and you can say, well, why don't you open up the restaurant again, right? Let the people in, you'll make more money, and oh, the conversations we can have. Or maybe you'll pass food out the door, or maybe you'll break down the glass or pull off the sign, or whatever you do, you will not be sitting there at the table saying, why don't those people just come on and sit down and eat? Because you will know something about the two-sided nature of the sign. The last story that I'm going to tell you actually is not based on one of my own real-life experiences. It's based on an image from the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. She just retired as being president of Spelman College. So I'm going to take her image, which I'll describe to you in a minute, and I'm going to elaborate on it. But her image is about racism basically as a passive process. It's like living life on a conveyor belt, right? Here, I'm going to put this mic on because I'm going to get on the conveyor belt in a minute. And it's about, just you're not trying to be racist, but you're on this conveyor belt and it's moving inexorably through racism and toward racism, okay? In fact, here we are on the conveyor belt, and we're just on the conveyor belt, not trying to be racist, just going to work, going to a job, and there's racism all around us, and racism, big sign, racism, boom, boom, boom. But most of us don't even look up to see the sign because we're just trying to live our lives, right? And maybe some of us look up and we see the sign, and then we close our eyes, we're in denial, and we just stay on that conveyor belt. Or we may look up and we see the sign, and then we turn around because we're colorblind, right? But we don't do anything else, and we're still on that same conveyor belt, just moving in that same direction. But now, I'm going to say, what about us in this room today who may feel like maybe racism really does exist? So we've been on the conveyor belt, but we look up in the sign, we see the sign, and we say, oh my God, I don't want to keep going there. What am I going to do? I don't want to be part of this passive process anymore. So the first thing that we're going to do, so now I'm into my part of it. She's a conveyor belt, so now I'm going to talk to us about how to be actively anti-racist. So the first thing we need to do is turn around on the conveyor belt, but not just stay, we need to start walking, right? Don't we? We need to become actively anti-racist. And we're going to be walking at least as fast as the conveyor belt is moving, not to keep getting swept in. And what happens when you're walking backwards on a crowded conveyor belt? You're going to be bumping into people, right? And they're going to say, hey, buddy, watch out. Where are you going? What are you doing? And this is our opportunity to do the first of 3 stages of being actively anti-racist, which is to name racism, to say, do you see where we're going? Do you want to go there, or will you turn around with me? Most people will just say, well, get out of my way, because they do not want to be disturbed out of their comfort. But maybe 1 or 2 will turn. So now you have 2 or 3 of you walking backward on this conveyor belt, and you keep bumping into people, and you keep naming racism and inviting them to turn around, and you'll never get 50%, but you'll get more and more turning around. So now as you get more and more, you're going to have like a critical mass. So now you're going to make some progress, not only getting away from racism, that big sign there, but getting to the motor that's making it work, right? So now we're going to keep bumping into people, we're turning, and now we found the motor. And now this is where we do the second stage of being actively anti-racist, which is to ask that question, how is racism operating here? And I think I see it. It's a lever right here. So I grab the lever and the system starts shaking because it was part of it, right? But racism is a very fancy system. So it reconfigures itself and it keeps on moving, which is why we need the third stage of being actively anti-racist, which is to organize and strategize to act. Because as I'm pulling on this lever, I need you to be pulling the pulley, and I need you to be swinging that dial, and I need all of us to grab some part of this system and to dismantle this system. I earnestly believe that all of us together can dismantle the system and put in its place a system in which all of us can know and develop to our full potentials. That is why I am launching this national campaign against racism. In 1 year as APHA president, I cannot do that. And furthermore, I can't do it by myself in 1 year, but I can put in place these structures. I can put in place the agenda setting so that we can harness the brilliance and the energy and the passion and commitment of everybody in this room to dismantle this system. I hope that I have energized you and engaged you. I hope that you will join me. Thank you so much.
And she just dropped the mic. No, it's fine. Extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. When I introduced you, I said I felt bad for the people who didn't get into the talk. And now I feel bad that we didn't put you in the Greek theater and force people to come. Because I really hope that Matt back there has gotten a good recording, because this talk should be required for everybody coming into this school. So, I don't know how much time you have. I know that if I don't get home and get some food on the table, my wife is going to shoot me, and you're not going to have anything to eat. So what I'd like to suggest is that we take 3 questions and then let people talk to you outside with a cocktail in their hand.
Well, may I ask? I think sometimes hearing the questions is more important than my answer. So if somebody could give me a piece of paper, I'd like to take 10 questions, just hear them, and then just quickly hit them. Is that all right?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so instead of question, answer, question, answer.
That's exactly right.
And so I also would like the people who have questions to actually come up here, bring the one mic instead of trying, this is more efficient. Bring the one mic up here, people stand in a line, address the question to me, but also so people can see who are asking the question, so you can look this way.
And you're going to ask very concise questions. And the first person standing up was John Powell, and you get to ask the first question, if you were still standing for that. Do you want to ask a question, John? You have something?
I need a...
Somebody give me a pen and a piece of paper, because I don't use those. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Oops,
okay,
sorry.
yes.
So thank you, Dr. Jones, and thank all of you. I guess the real question, I followed your work for many years, I've known you for many years, is really how do we at Berkeley, and particularly the Haas Institute, get involved? How do we make this a joint effort so you can actually create those structures and move it across so that after your 3 years, it continues?
I'm kind of floored by you, but...
Say who you are.
Oh, right, Sabine Dabadi, MPH student. I'm just curious how you can give examples how to think of those allegories, which are really rich and visceral and clear, especially to illustrate these kind of issues in a way that is really thought-provoking. Any strategies on it?
How do I come up with them?
Precisely.
So I'm going to ask one until somebody else comes up. I had to give a talk earlier in the week, and I showed maps of race and I showed maps of health. I didn't have a map I could show of racism. And then I thought to myself, I don't even want a map of racism, because that's too historically determined in terms of the variability. I want a map of progress against racism, so we can learn from best practices. And where on earth would I find that? And how might we generate it?
Any other questions, or shall I start answering these? Oh,
Thank you, Dr. Jones. My question is, you and I appreciate...
Say who you are.
Oh, Marilyn Thomas. So my question is, first of all, thank you so much for everything, but mostly for providing strategies on how to start this conversation in certain circumstances, which is a big piece of this. But I also am very curious, when you start having these conversations, it's often one of the questions that comes up when you're talking about racism is, what is race? So I'm curious as to how you define race in its complexities.
Hi, good evening. My name is Robin Pierce. I am not a student. I'm a community member, and I work for a public health organization in Oakland called the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. And I work with health departments and community-based organizations who provide HIV prevention services around the country. So I'm regularly in conversation with your colleagues at the CDC. My question is, what, in your experience, has been one of the most powerful ways that community can leverage funders to take those steps towards moving in the other direction on the conveyor belt?
Hi, thank you so much for coming, Dr. Jones. My name is Amelia Plant, and I'm a first-year MPH student in maternal and child health. And I'm really interested in how we make everyone understand that this is their problem, and specifically how we can explain that better health equity is better for everyone.
Thank you, Kamara. My name is Melanie Tervalon, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts for us about how we think about raising our children, our young children, to be anti-racist and to be pro-inclusion, all people. How do we do that with our little ones?
Hi, I'm Brooke Staten. I'm a second-year MPH MCP, and my question is, what advice do you have for all of us when we find ourselves in a position of being checked on our privilege and we're feeling very defensive and very angry and afraid, and the brain starts shutting down and you start saying silly stuff? You know, do you have advice for how to manage those feelings in a more productive way so we can act more bravely?
And we'll stop the line with the last person who's there right now. So we'll hear all of these. We'll hear all of these.
My name is Starla Gay, and I am a community advocate and activist and a board member of the Healthy Black Families Program. My question is, thank you. I'm so glad to see you here today first. My question is regarding CERD. I remarked to one of my friends that I think it's the perfect time to raise the issue of the CERD, and it's a perfect time to raise the issue that there is such a thing that exists, and to kind of demand that the politicians act upon it, that they hold themselves true, we as a nation, that we hold ourselves true to that treaty. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on how we can go about getting the United States to own up to this treaty and to deliver the messages of the treaty to the population, to the public. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alexander Wong. I am a health educator at Berkeley High Health Center. Right now, I am just fresh out of undergraduate. I'm very early in my career, and I feel very fortunate to be in the city of Berkeley and with the public health department, who has a strong commitment to racial, improving health equity and all these things. And I'm very afraid in my near future, when I continue my career and go around the country, that I won't be in systems that are as easy to kind of cope with. And I'm afraid of how I'll be able to affect the system when I'm early in my career and I'm not exactly empowered to do so at this point. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Lamisha Hill. I'm the director of the Multicultural Resource Center at UCSF. We have some UCSFers in the building. I wanted to ask, particularly in conversations and structures where we have shared values around education, or we believe collectively in these different issues, how do we translate that conversation when we're dealing with larger systems, such as large institutions, and then also in the corporate structure? We're in the Bay Area, we're in Silicon Valley, and these similar issues are very prevalent in issues or in places such as corporations, large tech companies, et cetera, and there have having similar conversations about diversity, but I don't know if us as educators are collaborating effectively with each other to build that bridge around economics and the social issues.
You guys are asking hard questions.
First, I want to thank you for Kamara. You're an inspiration, as usual. My name is Dr. Vicki Alexander. I am retired for 10 years now from the City of Berkeley Health Department. I was the Director of Maternal, Child, and Adolescent Health, and then the health officer in the City of Berkeley. But now retired, I'm doing what I want to do. So I'm working with the organization Healthy Black Families. I'm the chair of the board. My question is a little bit complex. I love your analogy on the conveyor belt because that's right where it is. And that's what I feel every day. And it's at many levels. And so my question of you is, where do we kind of start? Do we start with the Healthy Black Family, with a family, black, and health? Or we just start with the fact that people can't find jobs or housing or all of the above. But all the above is almost impossible to grasp, to put your arm around it and to organize around it. So how do we start, I guess is my question.
Wow, well, congrats to all the question askers. So I'm just going to hit things. In terms of a joint effort and Berkeley and the Haas Institute and all supporting us, really, I think that even if there was never a formal thing, so first of all, I'm going to ask you guys to help people the 7 standing committees that we have in our anti-racism collaborative. I used to think of it as racism and health collaborative and said you couldn't have racism and health, so racism or health. But now I want us to actually have an anti-racism and health collaborative because the science and practice of anti-racism is something that we need to expand. So I think by developing a science of anti-racism, how do you struggle? How do you when people throw up roadblocks, how do you analyze the roadblocks and then dismantle them and get around? So I guess developing a science and practice of anti-racism with us by providing some kind of people power for the 7 standing committees that I'm proposing for the Anti-Racism and Health Collaborative. But then for all of us, the 3 tasks are to name racism, ask how is racism operating here, and organize and strategize to act. So even if you never link up with me again or APHA or anything, wherever you are, if you name racism, ask how is racism operating here, looking at structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, and then you organize and strategize to act. That would be the way. The allegories, I come up with them because that's how I see the world. It's sort of weird. So I know that I have a good allegory if I'm like driving along or sitting or something and I say, oh, that's interesting. If I see an image and I say, oh, that's interesting, like I saw, a telephone wire with birds that landed on it, and then I saw how one by one they all turned to face in the same direction. I don't have an allegory for that, but like what it means. But it's something about life, and it's probably something about race and racism. So, so I store up things, Once we were trying to get some markers off of a whiteboard, and it was like somebody had used permanent marker instead of the removable marker. And then I said, oh, but if you take removable marker and put it on top of the permanent marker, that's how you can get off a whiteboard. So I said, oh, that's interesting. So I don't have what that is either. But I store up. No, but it's sort of like, but so that's how I do it. So I'm always observing things, and then so sometimes I know exactly what it means, and sometimes it takes a year or two to figure out what it means. But that's how I do that. So maps of race and health, and you said, well, you need a map of racism and the map of progress against racism. So I talked a little bit about anti-racism and all like that. But I think an interesting thing to do, I actually haven't published it yet, but I've talked about my Gardner's Tale plot. It's a 2-part plot. So in the first top of the plot, you would have some health outcome by some socioeconomic marker. So you might have birth weight by maternal education or something, and then you stratify by race. So we almost do that. Mostly we usually don't have both the social class and the race, but when we do, we can do that, and we stratify by race. But even if those 2 lines were the same, which mostly they're not, even if they were the same, we wouldn't have eliminated racial health disparities because the distribution of education is not the same. So under each of those plots, we also have to have the proportion of whatever population you have, so black versus non-black, whatever, for the different educational things. Now, and you put a line across it. So now if black folks are 10% of the population, then the proportion of black folks who are, kindergarten only or primary school or whatever, all of it should be 10%. But that's where you see the disproportionate distribution of income or education by race. That tells us that to get at that health outcome, what we need to do is not just do the little health interventions, but we have to change the distribution of social class by race. It's about the differences in the quality of the soil. So I call it my Gardner's tail plot. I know you couldn't understand it with my little hands and what I said, but anyway, and so you should encourage me to publish that, but that would be a thing that you could... But that would be a thing that we could do in public health. Strategies for starting conversations about what is race. So I talk about race as the social classification of how one looks. I have this measure, which we call socially assigned race, which is how do other people usually classify you in this country? Would you say black, white, black, Hispanic, or Latino, American Indian, or Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Asian, or some other group? So we take the so-called OMB race categories plus the so-called OMB ethnicity category, we put it all together, and we ask, how do other people usually classify you in this country? It's the substrate on which racism operates day to day. We have to understand that race is this social classification. Even in our data analyses, I don't think we should ascribe race to an individual. We should have a multi-level thing. We should have what is the socially assigned race for the individual, and then what is the racial climate in that given place and time. So there's another whole measure of racial climate that I'm thinking about, but we don't have time for that. Community leveraging funders. I don't know how to have the community leveraging funders, but I think the community should have a consistent message that we don't need a 3-year grant or a 5-year grant. We need a generational grant. You need to invest over 20 years in this community. How do we make people understand that racism is a problem for all of us? It's not the problem for the stigmatized folks. It's, actually, so the people who are benefited by this system actually have the biggest stake and the biggest influence in helping to dismantle the system. How do you make people understand it? I think my dual reality story, maybe start there. I don't have a real strong answer for that, but the dual reality helps people understand that there can be privilege that they're not really aware of, and that if everybody were able to come into the restaurant, then we could be having very great conversations and we could do a lot. Raising children who are anti-racist and pro-inclusion. I think that we have to, all of our families need to talk about racism at the table. White folks, mostly in this country, have grown up and their parents never talked to them about racism. And so then when somebody says racism is real, you're like, no, that can't really be true because my parents would have told me about that, right? So we have to take the opportunities, and the opportunity might just be when a young child says, well, looking at the Katrina videos, why are most of the people on the roofs black? Well, you talk about that. Don't say, oh, honey, and go on to something else. Seek out books, and I actually would like to make my Gardner's Tale into a children's book. I was talking to the American Academy of Pediatrics Board of Directors last week, and I said, the pediatric role might be to encourage all families to have discussions about racism, and then if we can give them tools for that, how much the better. So I think we have to have those conversations around the thing. What advice can I give when people are actually checked on their privilege and to give them to act more bravely? People have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. This is, I try to talk about racism. I talk about it as a system. I'm not trying to adjudicate who's racist and who's not, because this system is affecting all of us, right? But when we start talking about privilege, people get very anxious. People have to become comfortable in being uncomfortable. They have to be comfortable with maybe making a mistake or whatever, but this is something that is sapping the strength of the whole society, so it's an all-in solution. So the treaty, ICERD, a perfect time to raise the issue, I agree. So I haven't really known how to do that. People, when they hear me, they put it on their Facebook, and I don't know how to do it. So I think that maybe bring it up to local lawmakers and then maybe have a conversation with your state people and all. I talk about it all the time, but I haven't had the conversation with President Obama yet. I mean, if you guys can hook that up, that would be great. But I agree that it is time for us to let everybody know, use it as a community organizing tool, let people know that there is a treaty and we have international treaty obligations to do right. So there was a young man who said, He's early in his career, so he's here in Berkeley, and things are kind of copacetic, you know, like everybody's real progressive and all like that, although that's not true anywhere, right? And he didn't say that either. He didn't say that, but that's sort of how it took. But how as he moves to other places, should he engage? The thing is to engage with people who are doing real work that you're passionate about. And that passion will carry you forward. And don't get isolated, like do real work with real people who are organizing in communities, and you'll be okay. Then share values, so it's about, we're here in education, but how do we engage with larger institutions and corporations and collaborate? So in public, so we have this thing like, you know, health and all policies type of, you know, stuff and all. And then I changed, for APHA, we were trying to figure out how do we as APHA get into boardrooms and all. And so then I thought health in all boardrooms, but maybe it should be not just health in all policies and health impact assessment, it should be equity impact assessment, and then maybe equity in all boardrooms. How do we get into the boardrooms? Well, we have Kaiser folks right here, so here's one. They are supporting this work. They're trying to be vanguard in this work. So whoever asked that question, ask Dr. Karen Emmons and Brian and all these other people here about how to do that. But we have some people here, and there are probably other corporations represented. And then finally, where do we start? Do we start with black folks? Do we start with family? Do we start with health? Do we start with jobs, housing, all of the above? If I had to start anywhere, I would start with excellent educational opportunities for all of our children. And I would start with strong social security strong social supports around our children and our families. That's where I would start. And I actually haven't seen the finished version of the film Raising of America, so I don't know if they go there. But there's the same people who did Race, the Power of an Illusion, in which Dr. Powell appeared, the same film that did Unnatural Causes, you know, Is Inequality Making Us Sick, in which I appeared and many other people in this room. Paula, you were in that, right? I can't remember. Anyway, did Raising of America, and that's all about child and investing in our children. That's where I would start. And so thank you guys very much. And I think there's food out there.